political capital for like green technology and like a slow transition away from dairy farms that they may want to claim will instead happen on their side of the house, right? Because if you're like rapidly needing to involve your industry to produce like low quality product at the same rate or higher than like India and China, then you can't like have like green technology and regulation standing in your way. Thirdly, what did we tell? So that means that like eventually what that means is because we will never inevitably be able to keep up with India and China under what we're doing under the status quo, that means it will result in a crash. It will result in demand for dairy products plummeting and rural communities and dairy farms suffering as a result under their side of the house. So what do we say then about how the industry will be affected under our side of the house? They say that if we only have a small proportion of our exports being dairy cows, and note that it must be small because like there's not a huge market for premium meat, right? Like it's only a niche market, and then we're better able to like fill this like niche, this demand for premium green New Zealand meat. And we say also that it's actually easy for us to transition into this industry because we already have lots of infrastructure such as pastures and like silos and barns in which we can like store all this stuff. We don't see it being a rapid and disruptive transition. What do we say then about the environmental impacts? We told you at first about all of the extreme environmental harms which were caused by the dairy industry. We told you about catastrophic clearing of land, irrigation, which caused huge droughts in like typically wet places like Auckland. We told you about like dairy runoffs into waterways. We didn't really hear much response to this from the negating team about the fact that they'll like cut corners and that will result in more environmental harms. Here's why that's not true. Firstly, we told you at first and at second that like we have a premium brand to uphold now that we're better able to like fill that niche since it's only a small proportion of our export market. So like we can't like cut corners and keep like dairy cows in terrible conditions like in order to adhere to that. But secondly, we say that like even if they did, there are still less cows. That means less irrigation, that means less land being cleared for pastures. That means that even if the existing farms still cut corners, there would still be lesser environmental harms accrued overall. Proud to affirm.
Thank the speaker for their speech and welcome the second speaker from the negating team.
When the affirming team's first speaker came up here today and told us that the transition from sheep to cows was simply easy, we think they are completely ignorant of the massive detrimental effect this had on rural communities throughout Northland, throughout New Zealand, and the fact that their forced change by the government, a massive culling of these cows, would be far more dramatic and far more damaging than this natural transition that did happen away from wool throughout these communities. Two main points of clash for you today. Firstly, on the impact on the New Zealand economy, and then a second point on the environment and climate change, followed by my split point on how we improve global sustainability. So for this first point on the impact on New Zealand's economy, they told us that an over-reliance on dairy means China will simply take over our market, right? But this is not true because countries like US, China have had far greater dairy economies of scale than New Zealand for like decades. And yet New Zealand still maintains a net growth in our dairy production and export. Part of this is like our natural advantages, our natural resources, and part of it is how we've integrated a green image into our produce by implementing environmental friendly policies, unlike competitor countries. They told us that the transition away from sheep was easy. And speaking from Northland, there are countless towns which have fallen into poverty, disrepair, and lack of opportunity as a result of this transition. But why will this cull of dairy cows be even worse? Because demand for wool in the market was replaced by mass demand for dairy naturally, right? But what they're doing, trying to do on their side of the house is not the same, right? Because there's not that mass demand for legumes going around today. The whole alternative for rural New Zealand is that veggie burgers can replace the far greater global demand for dairy. That is not a reality that exists in our world today. This is a death blow to rural New Zealand. Even more nonsensically, their earlier point that China had better capabilities for dairy and would overtake us someday is actually true here in the case of like soy products and veggie burgers, because this time China can actually outproduce New Zealand with soy and legume products, and they actually do have far more capabilities for manufacture of synthetic things like veggie burgers. The case for economic growth completely falls apart here, because this imaginary niche market that exists for veggie burgers can nowhere near replace the massive and growing market for dairy that does exist, as they told us, throughout India and China, and is still growing today, right? What else do we see in terms of environmental and climate change aspects of this? This is largely integrated into my split, but I'll just address some of their points here. They told us that cows cause more emissions due to requirements of intensive farming in New Zealand, and that we keep dairy cows in horrible conditions, to which I'd like to say, please take a look overseas and contrast the cows here, which are kept in, open paddocks, to factory farm cows kept in tight little pens overseas. We actually think this comparative is very important, right? Because climate change is an international issue. So it does not mean much if we reduce emissions in New Zealand, only for us to export our industries overseas and emissions to increase over there, right? Because it's a worldwide international problem. More than that, at second, they said that India and China will completely overtake New Zealand's dairy industry, right? But if this were actually true, why is New Zealand supplying 40% of China's dairy intake right now, right? And why is that number growing to this day? It doesn't make any sense. But by claiming that China will take over production while also acknowledging that China's practices are less sustainable, they've conceded that their side of the house gains no benefits in terms of climate change because they're just importing this overseas to a worse industry, which was why they wanted to cull the cattle to begin with, right? To fix climate change. Their case is massively contradictory. They also brought us at, I'll take your point now.
Wouldn't you agree that at first we told you that the more important environmental issues were the ones we found in New Zealand, like waterway runoff and arable land use?
Firstly, I'm about to address both of those points right now in terms of land loss and pollution of waterways. But also, why is it so much more important to be able to have a more environmentally friendly image in New Zealand if what you're really doing is shipping this industry overseas to China, where the emissions are just as bad, have just as bad a global impact, will still affect us in terms of droughts, right? Because climate change is a global issue and isn't restricted to the borders of any one country. But going on to this point of land lost, right? Because their side of the house still requires all this farming they were talking about. So if they theoretically manage to replace with a massive industry of soy or like legumes or something. So they're still going to have deforestation if their new industry is that successful. But also we say countries like New Zealand have regulations against deforestation, countries like Brazil don't. And it's countries like Brazil that will fill the market hole left when New Zealand kills all their cows to actually start deforesting the Amazon, to start improving their production of dairy and things like that. They told us pollution of waterways is like the worst issue ever and will massively be worse on outside the house. First of all, in our model, we told you that we support regulations on waterway use and carbon emissions, and we support more investment for green energy, more funding for riparian planting, and fencing for farmers. We also deny the premise that a cull will save the environment anyways, right? Because with their implementation of a 50% plus cull rate, also at second, they conceded that some farmers would still exist, some like it wouldn't be completely wiped out. We think that the existing farmers are directly incentivized to cut corners. To stay afloat alongside this massive loss of revenue, farmers will not allocate funding towards pro-environmental practices, towards updating their infrastructure to be more efficient and environmentally friendly. But instead, they will dodge regulations. They will dodge oversight. They won't pay revenue or register when a waterway is on their property. They will simply use these in a desperate attempt to stay afloat now that the affirming team has pretty much taken away a large amount of their revenue. Then we say, even if pollution of waterways is reduced, The affirmative still exports the dairy market to countries with far more environmentally damaging practices, and they destroy rural communities throughout New Zealand. So because of this result on climate change and our economy, it's still not worth it. Now moving on to my split point on how we better improve global sustainability. We see that there's a growing international market for dairy products. We see that dairy intake in China and India and other countries, as they told us, has been rapidly increasing in past decades. And this is why New Zealand still remains competitive in selling dairy to these countries, directly inverse of what they were claiming. We do agree that New Zealand needs more regulations, we need more green initiatives, but our dairy practices, we are right now more humane and eco-friendly methods than many other countries around the world. Three main mechanisms for you on how we get better sustainability on our side of the house. Firstly, there's a massive global market for dairy. For example, Fonterra uses almost all of its produce to sell to China and doesn't even supply over 40% of China's intake. This growing market won't vanish when New Zealand kills all their cows, right? It will simply relocate its distributors to somewhere else. Competitive countries will ramp up milk production to fill this lucrative space in the market. Not everyone will suddenly convert to veggie burgers and go vegan and swear off milk. Second mechanism, dairy suppliers like American and Indian factory farms hold cows in cramped, inhumane conditions in tight pens, and they feed cattle with financially efficient but energy-intensive feed crops that grow quickly but suck up energy from non-renewable sources and damage our environment. In contrast, New Zealand keeps cows in like wide open paddocks, and we have a far higher composition of renewable energy sources in our energy grid, so we use far less carbon emissions when we actually feed these cows. Thirdly, the international reputation of New Zealand as a green country and pressure from environmental groups and a better developed infrastructure than other countries means New Zealand dairy follows more sustainable methods. We have protected national parks and reforestation efforts that prevent the mass unregulated deforestation of Amazon that will be accelerated when Brazil tries and produces more milk by finding more room for cows. So therefore, on our side of the house, we save rural New Zealand communities, we move towards an environmental future, and we prevent their massive economic collapse. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for this speech and welcome the third speaker for the proposing team.
If we have the opportunity to take action, to change things, but this opportunity is not going to last long. We see 3 points of clash in this debate: the economy, the environment, and the political control that comes from relying on China. So throughout our team, we have told you that this is winding down anyway, as China and India get more cows, and for example, and we're going to get outcompeted through economies of scale. China additionally will be wanting to encourage Chinese companies in the same way New Zealand wants to encourage New Zealand companies. And so because of this, they're going to be placing things like taxes on New Zealand dairy as they get more of their own. And so this is going to result in the gradual wind down of New Zealand's economy. And so this sort of presents us with an option. We can, as Ronan has said, we can continue on the path we are currently taking. We'll have to keep cutting corners as neither side wants in order to keep making profit. And eventually we'll reach a point where New Zealand angers China, and China stops buying New Zealand's dairy. And at that point, we will get the economic collapse like what happened with wool in the past. Alternatively, we can change, and that is what we want to do. By winding down on our terms, we've said we can subsidize transfers to other industries. So, for example, legume farming or alternative meats. And this will help New Zealand's economy, and will prevent the sudden shock which has led to so many people being unemployed in farming towns up north, which we want to prevent. And so at the end of this clash, we're the team that actually prevents economic shock, keeps people employed, and leads to a more sustainable long-term economy, leading to more long-term growth. And we maintain a premium brand while we're at it, which does not just include farming, but also includes other areas, cementing New Zealand as a place to be. On to the point about environment. Throughout our team, we've said that we stop land use, water use, emissions, and water pollution. No, they've said that the emissions will just move to China, and I'll be addressing this later. But they have not sufficiently explained why, how we're going to reduce land use, water use, and water pollution. Because remember, to get dairy, you first need to produce food to feed the cow. If we simply cut out that step, we can then save so much energy by and thus land, water, and water usage, and reduce water pollution. And that will, of course, make our environment better, which helps our tourism industry, which is a more sustainable and more lucrative industry, which is better, obviously. And yeah, so climate change is not the only problem. Additionally, New Zealand is in a position to help make things better in terms of climate change. We have the resources and the technology to innovate in farming and produce new methods. For example, lab-grown milk or whatever, or veggie burgers or stuff we don't even know of, right? And we are the country that is most able to do this because we have the technology and the experience which other countries do not have right now. And this economy, this industry would allow New Zealand to get more money, which is good for our economy, cement its place as a tech hub, and further make improve our opinion on the world stage, which is again good for our economy. And we can then license this technology to other countries who want to help meet their climate change goal, which again helps climate change in other countries. And so by doing this, we're actually reducing climate change over the world as well. Additionally, they said that we don't see a market for alternative meats. That's because it's brand new. We don't see it because it's not here yet. But we have an opportunity. This is a good thing because it means we can get on the ground floor. We can be the ones. We can be the alternative meat or the alternative dairy capital of the world. We can be the ones to actually people look to when they look to dairy or meat. And so we can still provide the premium brand. We can also provide the alternative that everyone else uses, and it's a win-win. And they also claim that farmers are going to cut corners. We don't think this is going to happen if they want to maintain their premium brand image, which is quite a problem. And so at the end of this point, we're the team which helps climate change, we're the team which helps the economy again, and we're the team which helps the local environment. Then finally, on the point about political control. Now, this is one that Ella brought up that hasn't really been sufficiently addressed. Basically, we sell most of our dairy and meat and other things to China. Now, this puts us in a precarious position. China does not want to rely on other countries. They want to produce their own things. Additionally, they don't want to rely on countries that politically disagree with them. So, things like freedom of speech. And so that is a problem because we want to keep our freedom of speech, right? That's important. So if New Zealand, for example, does things like endorses the Hong Kong protesters who are fighting for their freedom, China may simply say, no, we're not going to buy your milk. We can get enough from India and from our own things. And so for China, they'll be fine. They've got their own sources. They can go to Indian sources. And so they won't be affected at all. But New Zealand will be destroyed if we are not prepared. New Zealand relies on its dairy industry in a moment. And so this means that that means that if China stops buying our thing, we will suffer the economic collapse that the negated side wants to avoid, and us too. Yes.
If people are going to get more environmentally conscious in the future and buy more veggie burgers and things like that, why would they not continue to buy New Zealand dairy products? Because they understand, like you said, New Zealand dairy products are more environmentally produced than China's.
Because we think that there are people who won't be in a position to do that in China, for example, or who may not be aware of that because of China's restrictions on freedom of speech, which we again want to encourage. And so so at the end of this point, we're the side which actually maintains New Zealand's freedom, and which then we can ally with other countries to put us in a position to fight against China's tyranny. And if we continue to sell them our milk and rely on them, then China has all the power in this situation. That means that we are at their whims. We have to do what they say, and that is not a good thing because we do not want to live under an authoritarian regime. At the end of this debate, we're the side which helps the New Zealand economy, helps through things like moving into innovative sectors, increasing our brand, our high quality brand. We help the economy through reducing land use, water use, emissions, both locally and globally, which then helps our tourism industry. And we remain free from China's grasp. It's clear, you should vote affirmative.
Thank the speaker for this speech and welcome the third speaker from the negating team.
Today, I think the affirming team is trying to crash New Zealand's economy and run it into the ground. So today, two main points of clash that I bring to you. The first being who achieves better environmental outcomes, and the second being who gets better economical kind of aspects or impacts. So moving on to the first point of clash about who achieves better environmental outcomes. So we heard at first and again at second that, the New Zealand dairy industry, we're too over-reliant on it and it's causing immediate harms to New Zealand's environment. So we heard things like droughts and waterways and land loss, etc., etc. Okay, well, we heard several responses to this today. So the first being is what they failed to recognize is that there's always going to be a massive demand for dairy. So whether we're supplying it or not. So right now we supply 40% of China's dairy, like the whole country plus 40% of dairy. Now, if we suddenly cut our dairy farms by 50 to 70%, we're not going to be able to uphold that 40% demand from China. What this then looks like is China going to other countries, to find their milk and get that product because they still want it and there's still a big demand in that country. So we told you that the harms of this is that then you're pushing them to countries like America or India, like as we heard our second speaker bring about how they have horrible animal environments and living conditions where they're in pens. There's, they're giving superficial supplements to try and let them produce a lot of milk at once. They're increasing the carbon emissions and things like that. Like, it's not a good alternative compared to us providing that milk where we have cattle on open pastures, on grass-fed, where we have like community involvement and where we are actually front leading in environmental outcomes. So therefore we won kind of that main point about that because they're only transferring and relocating one harm to America. So the first thing they said they said that they use a lot of irrigation water and that, it's causing droughts like in Auckland. But I think what is happening is the reason why we're running low on like water in Auckland, I think it has more to do with the increased population living in Auckland than to do with the farming, farms in Northland, because each region of the country has their own dams and supply that. So I think that's a bit of a weird point for them to bring. But they also said things about like hurting the waterways and land loss, etc. However, I think what we stand for as the negating team today is we stand for like pushing more tight regulations, ensuring that the fences are up 100 meters away from the waterways and that the runoff isn't polluting it. And we also believe that there's a big incentive for farmers to uphold these themselves. Looking at a production standpoint, if you can say that you are clean and you're green, especially today's society where communities are like a lot clean green thinking and looking towards that and wanting support companies that actually are doing something to help, we actually feel like this is actually going to be incentivize them to keep going. Yes.
If we see that with competition with Asian countries, New Zealanders are forced to have worse and worse environmental outcomes, how are they going to be more clean and green?
So I'm a little confused about that point about how we think we're suddenly going to cut corners because we can't supply the demand that China is asking for. But I don't understand how under your side of the house, when you cut our industry by 50 to 70%, how that keeps us in the competitive running to supplying this and how that actually allows us to produce milk clean and green, right? So going on to another point about how when you cut it, Yeah, so that is why we believe we won this point about who achieves better environmental outcomes, because we've told you how it's just going to relocate to other countries because that demand is always going to be there. We've told you how New Zealand is in a unique standpoint to move forward and actually take initiatives, and why farmers are also inclined to do it because it's actually beneficial for them to have a clean farm so they're not spreading diseases. It's beneficial for them not to pollute the waterways that people are using because they're going to get a lot of, hate from the public if they're ruining everyone's waterways. And that is why we believe we won this better economical outcome. No. So moving on to the second point of clash today about the economical outcomes. I think today we heard in the model, we heard that they would, the affirmative team is going to provide subsidies for these farmers to compensate for the loss of their revenue that they are going to get by halving their farmers. But I'm sorry, have you not heard of something called COVID-19? I don't think New Zealand is in strong economical standpoint right now to go out and give, these subsidies to all of these farmers, let alone we've already given out so many subsidies, and in an economical standpoint, New Zealand cannot actually survive adding that massive impact with COVID-19. We're already struggling from the first lockdown and giving subsidies to people, and we're already in a lot of trouble there. And I don't think that is realistic to say that we could genuinely compensate for the loss that they're going to get by cutting it. So then what that leads on to, that the affirmative team have not rebutted or talked about at all is the harms that this comes from. So we have three groups that are harmed by cutting this industry and then losing revenue. So the first is the farmers, the actual people who own these companies and who, own these farms and produce these milks. You're halving their dairy, if you're having their cows, then that means that they're not going to be able to produce as much. They're not going to get as much money from the revenue because they're not selling as many products. What this then looks like is spreading out to the rest of the community. It means that they might have to, lay off people. And a lot of these people who work on these farms look like people who don't have uni degrees, look like people who are just in it for the hard and honest labor work that they do out of it. It just looks like people who, if they do get laid off, especially right now, that they're just going to be completely harmed. They're not going to be able to pay their bills. And then that has a massive trickle-on effect that the affirmative team have not even brought forward today. And the third group that is affected by this is the wider outreach in the community, because these farmers in New Zealand, because New Zealand's dairy and farming industry is almost as massive a part in our culture as, say, rugby is, right? It's a huge thing. And dairy farming industries, they get involved in a lot of things. You have like Fonterra sponsor courses and things like that for people interested in dairy. They sponsor things like Sphere, etc., where it's beneficial for people like that. So we've told you all the harms that would come, not to mention the fact that dairy industry is one of our biggest industries where we get and it produces a massive amount of revenue, not to mention the fact that all that money that we would lose, I don't understand where they think they're going to make it up. We also heard a lot about China shunning us and out competing us and things like that. However, I'm sorry, I don't understand how the affirmative team's model of halving our industry is actually going to help us stay in the competitive running for these products. And that is why, because we stand for New Zealand culture and the farming industry, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker for their speech. And as customary, we'll now reverse the order, and I welcome the reply from the opposing team.
As the negating team today, we saw the affirmative team bring forward an unrealistic characterization of how this market shift is going to work, unrealistic characterization of China and how the competitiveness of the dairy industry is going to work. And we see that overall, we didn't get much response on a lot of our substantial points. So we see that this debate has come down to two main points of clash. Firstly, who gets the better environmental outcomes? And secondly, who gets the better economic outcomes? So onto this first point. So why do we win this point? Firstly, what we brought to you as the negating team is that we would be able to invest in more economic, environmentally friendly technology, and we would increase regulations within New Zealand around waterways and things like that to prevent the damage that dairy farming is currently taking in New Zealand. Like we said that, like we acknowledge that there is a problem, like there is a problem, that it's something we can still develop and work on. But what we saw is that the where we think we won is that when the affirming team tries to come to us and say that like farmers are going to cut corners under the current status quo because the demand is too much for them to meet. We think this was a completely unrealistic characterization when in the like if the affirming team actually did introduce this model and culled farms, we recognize that there would actually be an incentive on farmers to like cut corners because they're actually going to be forced into this decision because they're now like they're not actually going to have an income. They have a reason. Right now we actually have like farmers and things that actually make enough revenue to do environmental initiatives. If we take this away, like they're actually going to have the incentive to cut the corners and to, because they're going to be faced with like, are they going to cut employees or are they going to cut regulations and things like that because they could still get income. And we saw that even, so then we brought that like, even if there was like, say a negative toll on New Zealand by having dairy farming here, we recognise that like even if there's a negative toll in New Zealand, like by culling our cows, we're actually just supporting like more like worse environmental and ethical situations in other countries and businesses. On our side of the house, we do not neglect our responsibility to helping global climate change because we recognise that this is something that is going to like affect not only New Zealand but other countries as well, and that when we are contributing positively to this situation, we think that that is a very big win, and we think that's something that we saw very little response to from the affirming team. So on to our second point of clash about who gets the best economy. What we saw brought forward from the negating team was this idea, the affirming team, was this idea about like, we're just going to go to like these plant-based veggie patties, a very unrealistic characterization of the market shift. We see they completely disregarded like the cultural and like just the massive demand for actual meat within the world. And we thought this was a really ridiculous alternative, especially when the AF team tried to characterize China as a major like dairy competitor who was somehow going to like have massive tensions with New Zealand if we continued our like dairy farming, when legumes and like synthetic meats and things like that is an industry where China is actually leading it. And we think that was a very unrealistic thing, and we think that this was a point that the affirmative team really lost on because they just did not characterize it in a realistic way. And we see that even when it comes to plant-based alternatives, like there just isn't the demand for it. So there isn't actually going to be like this big economic like income from it that the affirmative team tried to paint. And therefore, because we actually get realistic outcomes and we get better global and national sustainability outcomes, we think that, well, we're proud to negate this move.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and to wrap up the debate, welcome back the reply speaker from the affirming team.
Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I'll start again. The negation team's marginal benefits in this debate were contingent on a very assertive and contradictory case. Here is how we unraveled that case over the course of our argument. So what did we tell you that we supported at first in terms of both the economy and the environment? We told you in terms of the economy that our current system was not sustainable, that places like China and India were emerging industrial economies, which meaning that their dominance is going to grow over time, right? Like it's not just going to stagnate at China importing 40% of its dairy from New Zealand. Are able to produce economies of scale and utilize looser regulations to massively outcompete New Zealand on the global market and make us lose the competitive edge. What did we tell you? We told you that making the herd smaller will enable us to exclusively entrench a premium image because we can engage in the small niche demand for a premium market, whereas if a large percentage of our dairy exports, if our economy continues to rely on a large percentage of our dairy exports, we can't have that widespread premium image because we have to effectively engage other consumers, right? That's what we told you. What did we hear in response? They kind of asserted that into the future, the demand for dairy would stay the same, that China was always going to be willing to import our dairy products, and that it would the increased development of their industries would make no difference in that. They simultaneously said that under our side of the house, farmers would cut corners in order to meet demand, but also that we have this clean green image under the status quo, and that we have this clean green image under the status quo, and that farmers would adhere to that. So we told you, we gave you analysis in response to this about how the industries of China and India are developing and why they are able to produce industries of scale, which give them the competitive edge. We told you that, secondly, on the environmental impacts, what did we say? We gave you reasons why green technologies, as they would like to put it, and a slow transition are not enough. Why we need a sudden cull. Why is this? This is because under the status quo, dairy farming produces massive harms which are exclusive to New Zealand, right? Which means that even if China's emissions increase marginally, we still get these we don't get rid of these harms unless we wind down dairy in New Zealand. These are things like runoff, destruction of land, including land owned by local iwi. We see an increase in irrigation, which means there is not enough water for Auckland, right? That's how they ended up with their drought. That's the direct connection between dairy farming and an increase in droughts. We see this as rapidly accelerating. So a slow transition into slightly more efficient farming over time isn't really going to be enough. Secondly, we said that under the status quo, when we have to appease a wide range of consumers, not all of whom adhere to a clean green image, not all of whom are premium consumers, that there's insufficient political capital produce the green changes that they would like to bring to us on a meaningful level, right? Because of all the analysis we gave to you throughout our speech. Whereas we provide an exclusive opportunity to provide a premium niche, which is kind of relies on farmers being green and cutting emissions and stuff like that. We are proud to affirm.
Okay, thank you very much.